I'd like to look at the business aspects of it. So it's undeniable that in the world we currently live in, consumer behavior actually drives change because we have so much technology, so much hyperconnectivity, which generates even more data. And this is what we're talking about today. So if we look at the demographics, at the end of 2016, there were 7.2 billion people in the world, of which 1.3 billion people actually routinely work remotely. 2016, 6.4 billion connected things by the end of last year. 2018, it is predicted that 45% of the fastest growing companies will have fewer staff than instances of smart machines. Again, more data. And then by 2020, there'll be 24 billion connected things, 7.7 billion people, 85% of customer interaction will be handled without a human. Again, more data. So let's have a look at this. So again, more data. And it's not just social media. It's the Internet of Things. It's wearables. It's connected homes, connected cars. It's connected smart cities. We all want instant fulfillment. We all want ubiquity. We want to be able to do everything from everywhere. And that, yet again, means more data. So we are spoiled for choice. And we demand more. There's more and more data, there's more connectivity, there's more technology, there's more computing power that enables us to do that. We can do more complex analytics, more insight. There is an incredibly extended supply chain, and there are more ways to commercialize and to monetize because undeniably data is actually the new money. But with all that, it also introduces more risk. So managing risk is absolutely crucial. I'm sure you've seen the headlines in terms of last year's headlines in terms of how much it cost in terms of cybercrime to economies, but the figures recently released by CFAS and the FFA. We need to be serious about information security. More and more we see this getting the board's attention. We need to manage the extended supply chain, and that is a real problem. We need to understand how new technologies can actually help us streamline operations. And we, of course, need to understand regulations, which is why we're here this afternoon. But when we look at regulation, I'm often asked, well, what should I look at? And it can be actually extremely confusing because it is a very complex landscape. So there are many regulations. We have the EU-US Privacy Shield for data transfer. We have the e-Privacy Directive. We have the Payment Services Directive in financial services. We've got PCI DSS to protect cardholder information. We've got the NIST Directive. We've got the new Trade Secret Directive, which actually redefines or standard definition of trade secrets and copyright. We have, of course, the GDPR. And we've got the fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive. So I've given you an example in the financial services sector, but there'll be many others in other sectors, such as gaming, for example. So if we look at all of this, what we can see is that there are many of them. This is not an exhaustive list. And when you look at them in detail, they very often intermingle, overlap, and sometimes conflict. So we need to be very aware of that. And that creates many, many silos. So as I said, you've got the security and privacy directives, which are just shown on the previous slide. And to take an industry example of financial services, we've got the second Payment Services Directive, which comes into force in January 2018, shortly before the GDPR. We've got, as part of the PSD2, the European Banking Authority's strong customer authentication requirement, which will come about at the same time. And then we've got the fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which will come into force this June, so only a few months. So looking at these, if we look at the GDPR, comes into force in May, as you all know, applies to data controllers and processors. That's really important because that actually puts the supply chain in very firm focus. It applies to processing carried out by organizations that are within the EU or outside the EU if they offer goods and services to EU citizens. It extends the definition of personal data and defines sensitive personal data and makes specific provisions for children. Unlike other countries such as the United States, where they've had regulation for the protection of children's information, such as the US with COPPA, that is the first time this is happening in Europe. Stringent requirements on consent and explicit consent, and that can get very confusing. And there are also new rights for individuals: portability, profiling, erasure, which was previously called right to be forgotten, access to your data, which is free of charge, so that £10 fee is no longer applicable. We've got privacy notices, which we need to look at. And of course, we've got the creation of this new thing called the Data Protection Officer. And the GDPR is about accountability, transparency, and governance. If you look at the e-Privacy Directive, it is adjunct to the GDPR, will come about at the same time. So May 2018 for EU member states. It includes social messaging applications such as Skype, WhatsApp, and so on and so forth. This was a couple of days ago. Messaging app from Google essentially is in breach of privacy rules. It aims to actually provide a single set of rules for people and businesses in the EU, because it's currently disjointed. There will be implications on direct marketing. A previous speaker actually mentioned that. Who do you send to? What you can do? Can you send them, email campaigns for consent? And there are different requirements depending on whether it is direct marketing B2B or B2C, so slightly different. There are simpler rules on cookies. So marketers, I'll hear marketers will say, yes, hooray, about time. Protection against spam and more effective enforcement. Enforcement is going to be crucial with the new set of regulations that are coming about. Then you've got the Trade Secrets Directive. Its proper name is the Directive on the Protection of Undisclosed Know-how and Business Information. So will be implemented throughout the EU during next year. Also aligns with the GDPR. It harmonizes the definition of a trade secret which must meet all, and I emphasize all, of the following requirements, which means it is secret. So which means it is not something that is generally known among or readily accessible to persons within the circles that normally deal with the kind of information in question. Has commercial value because it is secret, all of that makes sense. But it's the third one that's a killer, because the third one says has been subject to reasonable steps under the circumstances by the person lawfully in control of the information to keep it secret. So basically what that says, everybody needs to have classified that data, understand what it is, and take steps to make sure that it is protected. So, and because it must meet all of that, if a company actually loses trade secrets and they don't meet all three criteria, well, a judge will say, well, it wasn't a trade secret, you didn't keep it secret. So focus on cybercrime and the requirement for businesses to take greater steps to protect what they regard as their trade secrets. So I think this one actually passed under the radar somehow, so I think you should pay attention to that particular one. Then we've got the EU-US Privacy Shield, which you should all know about, came into force in June of last year. This is about data transfers, will particularly affect, for example, cloud storage and cloud services, protects the rights of anyone in the EU whose personal data is transferred to the United States. So strong obligation and so on and so forth. It aims to protect individual rights. And apparently, President Trump hasn't actually reneged on this. And it is due to have an annual joint review mechanism, which means it's due in June of this year. So we shall be watching with interest as to what happens there. And then we, of course, have our beloved PCI DSS for the protection of cardholder information. I've put it under the regulation section, not because it is a regulation, certainly not in Europe. It is in some United States of America. But because since it is part of card scheme regulation and part of the operating regulation, and that you cannot take or accept card payments without complying with those operating regulations, it's as good as regulation. OK, then we've got the NIS directive, which I'm sure you're familiar with, came into force in July 2016 for EU member states, makes its way through regulation various ways, including the cybersecurity strategy here in the UK. So, and focuses particularly on sectors that rely heavily on IT to provide fundamental services to citizens. So energy, transport, water, banking, financial market infrastructures, healthcare and digital infrastructure, must implement appropriate security measures and must notify serious incidents. So again, this is an interesting one because the requirement for notifying serious incident under the NIS directive are slightly different from those under the GDPR, which means sometimes it may be a double whammy. You need to report there, and you need to report for the GDPR as well. So I'd advise you to look at all of that in conjunction. And key digital services providers, such as search engine, cloud services, and online marketplaces, must comply with all of that under this new directive. So, and then we've got financial services directive, such as the Payment Services Directive, comes into force in January of next year. For the first time in financial services, we have a directive that focuses on security, as well as all of the other financial stuff. But that's the first time that this is very explicit. So focus on security and incident reporting. It's also cross-reference to the NIS directive. It deploys strong customer authentication, and the requirements have been published already by the European Banking Authority. It extends coverage to third-party providers, which were previously unregulated. So those guys, for example, Apple Pay, for the sake of argument, that means, again, focus on the supply chain here. And it promotes open access and competition to infrastructures that have traditionally been quite closed. Then we've got the fourth anti-money laundering directive, which comes into force in June of this year, as I mentioned earlier. There's a new requirement for financial institutions to include data protection policies within the AML policies and procedures for customer information sharing. So again, supply chain. Big requirement on know your customer, so customer due diligence, beneficial ownership, which means that under AML, you will collect more data. So there's more data to protect. So you have to look at AML in conjunction with the GDPR in terms of retention policies. So business and personal accountability, it will be transposed into law. So regulation and standards are numerous. It can be overwhelming, but automation has actually created a new industry. For example, this company helps you with money laundering requirements. This one, wire transfer fraud. This one launched a GDPR robot. And if you want to look at an interesting report, Deloitte, RegTech Universe, January 2017, it gives you a whole plethora of RegTech companies that can actually help. So, previous speaker spoke about insider threats. So let's not forget, that is one of the biggest risks, common denominator. 75% of incidents are linked to people, and also 63% are linked to third parties. So addressing those two gets you a long way towards compliance. So establishing a staff data protection program to address insider threats, absolutely crucial. Phishing, malicious behavior, miscellaneous errors, lost and stolen devices, again, all plays towards the GDPR, and you've seen the Boeing breach earlier. Then establish a supply chain review program. So you've seen in the news a couple of days ago, NHS Wales lose personal data in breach, procurement processes, contracts, data location and transfer, and the SEO is on them under the Data Protection Act. So for those who saw my presentation last year, you will have seen this whole thing about what you can do to start a good GDPR program in terms of the people and process aspect and in terms of the technology aspect. It's nothing new. These are all things you should be doing as part of a good information security policy. So, and liaison for the data protection officer, chief data officer, the CISO, chief risk officer, HR, legal, PR, comms, and of course the CISO and CIO in charge of the technology aspect of all of that. So the Internet of Things introduces new challenges, as I've said earlier. So a new challenge is toys and more toys. In fact, I'm sure you've seen the VTech breach last year, but there was also the one about the Kayla dolls. And the thing is, the GDPR makes new provision in Article 8 for children's consent. So it's something you have to look at. Then we have the latest one, which was Cloud Pets. Again, another data privacy breach. And therefore, organizations should look at age verification measures, parental consent, and all of those good things. And there's more toys. So we've seen the problem about Samsung TVs or connected TVs. So manufacturing companies that manufacture these kind of devices, again, should look at privacy. Privacy notices are becoming extremely important. And there's even more toys and even more sensitive data. This one happened a couple of days ago. And not only were they collecting data, they were also collecting even more information to actually know timing, temperature, when used, and so on and so forth, so they can further profile their customers to offer them even more products. So from data collection, we're actually now into profiling, and they issued this glib reply saying that the security of their customers' information is obviously very important to them. But sensitive personal data in the GDPR definition says racial, ethnic, political, religious, or philosophical, trade union, genetic data, biometric, health, sex, life, or sexual orientation. So these people are in big trouble. And I'm red, and I'm nearly finished, John. So big data, AI, and profiling. And this smacks a bit like a Minority Report. So looking at these things, profiling is a thing that you should be looking at on the GDPR, because there are more opportunities to actually do these things. Those that develop products, such as, I think this one was Equifax, to actually take credit information to derive credit scores based on social media profiles, again. So privacy notices, fair processing, minimization, portability, purpose, limitation, and consent are all those things. So, and the other thing to look at is data quality, because data quality becomes very important under GDPR, because we have a right to have our data actually corrected if it is wrong. And I'm moving on. There will be definitely a shortfall. Lots of guidance from the ICO in terms of consent, which is here. Do you always need it? No, you don't, because content is not the only legal basis for processing, and it's not appropriate if you do it anyway, if you made it a precondition of accessing services, or if you are in a position of power. These are the other way you can do it without consent. The presentation will be made available by the organizers for those who are worried. And then you have the recitals. John, I've nearly finished. It is important to look at the recitals, not just the articles, because the recitals is how a judge will actually interpret the data. I've got some example there as to how this actually happens, where the ICO could actually be overruled. And then we have transparency and accountability with the privacy notices. What I would like to leave you with is that the most important person that you could think of is the DPO, the Data Protection Officer, needs to do all of this. In summary, it needed to be responsible for application of policy, assignment of responsibility, staff training, and all of those things, which means, in fact, they should be wearing a cape, or in fact, she should be wearing a cape, because we're going to need 28,000 of them to actually fulfill GDPR obligation. So here we go. This is the end. Look, look, I'm finished. So familiarize yourself. I'm finished. Thank you, John.